Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today I'm joined by Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C., Meghan Bodette. Welcome to the show, Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me, Elif.
So, Northeast Syria is being integrated into the Syrian transitional government. The January agreement between the SDF, so the Syrian Democratic Forces, and Damascus set some quite significant and crucial terms. On Sunday, 24th May, elections were held finally in Hasaka and Kobane for the transitional parliament. Meghan, the January 29th agreement was supposed to bring Northeast Syria into, as we said, the new transitional government. SDF forces have, for all intents and purposes, been integrated into the army. A governor has been appointed for Hasaka, which is a very important center of operations for the Northeast, or has been. Elections just happened. You have previously reported a very different reality on the ground, appointments made without consulting local authorities and, local structures. People from, Idlib and HTS-linked, so Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the organization that the Syrian transitional government comes from. Those structures being installed over communities they've never lived in, and the democratic administration of Northeast Syrian negotiators, nominees for key positions being rejected. So there's a lot of reports. There seems to be progress. There seems to be various ways that things are stalling. There seems to be risks. There seems to be opportunities, which all of which we'll talk a bit about today. But can you walk us through where the agreement actually stands, what's being implemented, what hasn't, and what's happening that wasn't in the agreement at all?
Right, that's a very good question to start us off. And so first I want to say that I was in Qamishlo in northeastern Syria during the war in January that was halted with the engagement of this agreement. And I think we can say the most important part of the deal is that it prevented the ethnic cleansing of the predominantly Kurdish and also, Christian and Yazidi areas of northeast Syria that were under the control of the SDF at the time. These communities are still alive. They are still living on their land. They did not have to flee their homes, like we saw in the case of Turkish intervention in Afrin and Serikani. And that in and of itself, we can say is a positive building block for future integration. It was very much not inevitable that the reality would have been that way when we looked at the conduct of groups involved in the army and the conduct of advancing forces towards the Northeast. At the same time, many of the ways in which the agreement has been implemented have been very detrimental to the full civil and political rights of communities in the Northeast, including as well women in those communities. If we want to start with the positives, there are a few. We've seen that displaced people have been able to return to Afrin. Several convoys have been organized as a result of security collaboration between autonomous administration affiliated forces and government affiliated forces. People are able to reclaim their homes. There's still some villages that are under occupation, but in general, people have been able to go back. And the predominantly Sunni Arab settlers who were moved in by Turkey to change the region's demographics have been mostly returning to the areas where they are from. We've seen the successful integration of members of the YPG and the SDF into the four brigades formed by the agreement. That's going well. We've seen Kurds who were made stateless by the Ba'ath regime able to apply for citizenship. So there are aspects of this agreement that are moving positively. But at the same time, there are real areas for concern, right? If we look at, for example, language rights and education, there were two articles of the agreement that focused on education. And of course, Syria's president issued a decree prior to the agreement claiming that Kurdish would be a national language in Syria. We're not seeing that being implemented. One of the main motivations, for many people's struggle and resistance, and one of the areas actually that caused many people to first get involved in politics was this repression of the Kurdish language. But now we're seeing that language is being excluded from public life, on public signs and government documents. There are concerns on the fate of the thousands of women who served in the YPJ, the all women's, detachment of the Syrian Democratic Forces. they're not being allowed to integrate into the army, even though the agreement made no mention of only men being able to integrate, for example. And Syria's constitutional declaration actually supports a right for women to participate in all public institutions. There are political appointments being made that are not being made with the consent of communities. The two positions that were assigned to the SDF to choose nominees for in the agreement, those have both been filled by relatively, strong Kurdish figures. But there have been no Christian or Yazidi figures appointed to any position, and just one woman appointed to a position, the Kurdish mayor of Kobani. So there's concerns about representation there. Overall, I think we're seeing the government trying to impose a very, Sunni Arab dominated, male dominated system on the Kurdish, Christian, and Yazidi communities of the Northeast, and on a political system that had preserved linguistic pluralism, religious freedom, and many laws and institutions that gave everyone a seat at the table. So that is very concerning.
So, I mean, as you've said as well, and touched upon, one of the most significant achievements in the Northeast was education rights, and particularly, for the first time, the ability to be educated, receive education in the Kurdish language. You know, especially after 2012, millions went from not even existing as far as, state bureaucracy was concerned in terms of not having citizenship to a whole generation learning in their mother tongue. But now it seems where there has been, more significant steps in the integration, Kurdish language has been reduced to twice weekly electives. So Kurdish is allowed, but the actual education is itself is not being organized in Kurdish. And as you said as well, that it's been a big part, and I think a big kind of emotional blow almost of bilingual signage on government buildings, like such as in Khamishla, has been torn down and replaced with Arabic only signs at least 3 times. Syriac has been removed from public signage entirely, which is another, very ancient language in the region. And, you know, some in the government want to rename Kobani, which, as many people will know, was a bastion of the fight against the so-called Islamic State, to its Ba'ath era Arabic name. And, as you've said, some of the positives have been that many stateless, particularly Kurdish people, have been able to apply for citizenship. But even in those citizenship forms, they have to still, you know, elect that they are Arabs, or that that's the only option for them. And another crucial point, seemingly, is that the YPG, so the women's protection units, have themselves, because of this issue with integration, have declared for quite some time that disarmament is a red line. So, with all of these happening, if there were risks to this agreement, which seems both sides do, where possible, want it to continue, which of these flashpoints could actually break the agreement, do you think?
Well, I think that the sort of derisiveness of the government towards Kurdish identity and Kurdish civil and political rights as a Kurdish community, not just as atomized individuals, is the factor that's most likely to put the fate of the agreement into question. I think that this is where you see real public anger. You mentioned, for example, the dispute over signage in Hasaka. We've written about this as well. This isn't the first time that there have been protests by young people against not just the Syrian transitional government, but against Kurdish appointees in that government and against the actual integrated Kurdish security forces that are now defending government institutions because they, through this integration deal, have become part of the state as well. We saw similar protests on Nowruz, the Kurdish New Year, when Kurdish youth in the city of Qamishlo took down Syrian flags from government-affiliated sites after images circulated of Arabs beating up Kurds who had Kurdish flags, taking their Kurdish flags away from them, threatening and humiliating them on the roads while they were celebrating Nowruz in areas like Aleppo and Afrin. So you've seen on more than one occasion, these young people, many of whom came of age, grew up during the war, during the period of self-determination, who've lost a lot, who've lived very difficult lives, and who are now seeing kind of these advances that all of those sacrifices, they might believe were worth being taken away. Something like the use of your own language in public life, it's an assertion of identity. And it's also a very cut and dry form of discrimination to have this taken away from you. If a language that you don't understand or that isn't the language that you use as well is the language in which you have to study, you have to interact with the police, the courts, a state hospital, you're at a disadvantage compared to someone who gets to do that in their own first language. Then, of course, there's the emotional sort of national identity side of it as well. So when you combine these practical concerns and these identity concerns, and you have this society that has really never known a world where they couldn't use Kurdish in every area of public life. You get these protests. So far, they have calmed down. I think that, the leadership still of the Kurdish, structures still have the ability to, ask their constituents to be sensitive to some of the concerns in the integration deal. I think some of the issues that we're seeing are related to a sense of moderation, while there are vulnerable communities, for example, displaced people who still have to return, prisoners of war who were captured by the government, who the SDF still needs to get back. But I don't think they're going to be able to control that sentiment forever. Right now in Northeast Syria, there's a generation of Kurdish people who grew up knowing self-determination, and it's very difficult to then ask them to call themselves Syrian Arabs and, speak Arabic in everyday life. And then when you look at the concerns of women and religious minorities, people might say, oh, these are smaller or less powerful constituencies. But I think when the government chooses to exclude or marginalize a constituency like this because it views this constituency as smaller or less powerful, that shows the government's attitude towards essentially any constituency that it feels it has the capacity to step on, which is a very damaging attitude towards civil rights for anyone.
I want to ask you, there's quite a lot to follow up there. And the first thing I want to ask you is, particularly around Newroz, which, is a new year, like the spring equinox that's celebrated, quite strongly by Kurdish people, but also many peoples in the region. Some of the events that unfolded, particularly some of the, like violent racism that you mentioned, was there any statement or any reaction from either, Ahmed El-Shara, who is the, the president the interim president of Syria currently, or anyone in his cabinet? Was there an effort to almost condemn that?
Well, what was really interesting was that while these violent incidents were going on, you had leaders from the transitional government and leaders from the SDF in Damascus celebrating Nowruz together, right? So you have these political figures who, despite, fighting a war against each other, and despite real grievances, among the Kurdish community towards this new state, are able to be civil, are able to put on a political display of, look, we're trying to show, if not even the foundations, maybe at least the blueprints of equality. Here are state officials and Kurdish officials together celebrating a holiday that is celebrated by Kurds, but is not celebrated by Sunni Arabs, for example. So you had this kind of display of unity, of openness going on at the same time as you had the government's social base attacking the social base of the Kurdish structures. And if Syrian leaders were genuinely invested in a project of pluralism and equal citizenship, one would think that they would be able to condemn that. But unfortunately, there were no condemnations of this kind of behavior. And then even Kurdish leaders who have integrated into the government sort of both sides the situation. They said, okay, you shouldn't take down Syrian flags, but also, they shouldn't attack Kurdish flags and symbols either. This led to a lot of anger among Kurdish people because they're saying, how can you equate us, protesting essentially government property or government symbols with them, attacking people for celebrating a holiday. These things are not the same. But I think it speaks to the very tenuous position that these leaders are in. Again, it speaks to some of the sensitive files that they have to resolve, where the government has a lot of power over vulnerable people, like the prisoners of war, like the displaced people who are returning. And, I think it goes to show that if there's going to be progress on not just the settlement of the Damascus SDF conflict, but the resolution of the Kurdish question in Syria. And I want to make a very important point here. This agreement settled the military conflict between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian Transitional Government. It is not a political solution to the Kurdish question in Syria. Kurdish rights in Syria are still very much up for debate and contestation. And this is, I think, the source of a lot of the public grievance. But if this political question is going to be solved, it's going to be as much at the initiative of the people in the streets as it is at the initiative of these political leaders who are making, I think, more compromises.
Much has been said about what was actually built in the Northeast, and you've spoken about it a little bit as well. And in the Jazeera region, the People's Council included, Kurds, Arabs, Syriacs, Armenians, Chechens, and Yazidis. And you've also spoken a little bit about it today, that the co-chair system meant every leadership position was shared between a man and a woman, often from different communities across the region. Can you, you've been to parts of the Northeast, quite a few times in the last period. Can you tell me a bit about how perhaps particularly women are talking about, what this co-chair system has meant for them, and what the possible breakdown of it or the risk of it breaking down would also mean for them?
That's a really important question. This is one of the really unique innovations of the Kurdish women's movement. And it is a policy that, as you alluded to, has increased both the representation of women in decision-making roles and the representation of diverse communities in decision-making roles. Because, of course, if you can have two co-chairs, you can have one who's a Kurd and one who's an Arab, or one who's a Muslim and one who's a Christian, or something like this. And when I interviewed co-chairs for a study that myself and my coworker at the Kurdish Peace Institute, Aras Yusuf, did in 2024, we did a survey of co-chairs at all levels of different institutions. And when we asked these women, what do you think is the primary, goal or aim of the co-chair system? We were expecting that they would say something like gender equality or women's freedom or something like this. But you know what they actually said? They talked about collaborative and anti-individualist decision making, right? They made the point that if you have two co-chairs, a man and a woman from maybe different political parties or different communities, two different people have to make decisions together. And that is the sort of nucleus of, I think, a more democratic or collaborative leadership model. So all of these advances that the system brought in are now under threat, with the government, not only, of course, rejecting it, but also preferring male leaders for political appointees in the region. I know that many people we spoke to said that the SDF originally nominated women for the posts of governor of Hasaka and for deputy minister of defense. The government rejected the female candidates that were put forward. The only woman who's been given an appointment in the integration process is the mayor of Kobani. No Yazidis have been appointed, no Christians have been appointed. So this is something that we're really seeing all of these forms of diversity go away and this sort of model of collaborative leadership go away. And that has impacts on, of course, the status of women, the status of the representation of different communities, and this kind of democratic mindset that the model was trying to build. Now, when I speak to women leaders about what they're going to do going forward, one idea that's been discussed is something similar to what municipalities in Turkey run by the pro-Kurdish parties have always done, where you have the official chair of the municipality, the mayor, and then you have the co-chair who's a member of, I think the way they do it is the municipal elected council, right? So you don't technically have co-chairs because the law in Turkey doesn't allow that. But in the actual day-to-day operation of the system, you do. So people have talked about adopting something like this. And many women see things like the destruction of the co-chair system, the refusal to integrate the YPJ into the army, as indicative of a broader attitude of the government that is, at best sees women's rights as something tokenistic. They can point to, here's our one female cabinet minister. Oh, here's the president's wife. She has a degree from a university. These things that are very, I don't even less than basic, right, in the Northeast. For Kurdish women having one ministry out of 23, or, a leader allowing his wife to go to school. These are nothing, right? They see this as very tokenistic at best, and at worst as a sign of the potential for the deterioration of women's rights. People point to Iran, for example, after 1979, restrictions on women's dress and conduct in public life and the roles that they could have weren't implemented all at once. It came slowly and it wasn't contested. And so there's a real fear that, for example, if they say today, well, women can't join the Ministry of Defense, they can't serve in the army. Tomorrow they might say, okay, well, we allowed women to integrate into the internal security forces to serve as police and internal security, but maybe we're going to stop allowing that, right? Where is the line drawn? And that fear, I think, is very real.
You spoke a lot about kind of almost the slight division of both position and thought between the high level leaders and on a society level. I want to speak a little bit about the civil society that many people, especially early on, just after Assad was, well, ousted, people spoke about where civil society could return to Syria, and I think many are already quite disappointed by the limitations that they've already seen and some of the curtailing of the potential activities of civil society organizations and so on. Are there attempts that you know of on a Syria-wide level of, you know, civil society or society beyond, high-level representatives getting together and discussing what a social contract for the future of Syria could look like?
Yeah, I think we have seen civil society all across the country, representative of a wide variety of political views, certainly in the Northeast and other parts of Syria as well, trying to seize this as an opportunity. Like you said, that hasn't always been easy, but also there is during this transition certainly much more opportunity for them to do that than there ever was, under the Ba'ath regime before, and more opportunity than there often was in wartime conditions. I think we've seen some of the Kurdish civil society and political parties engaging a bit more in Damascus, trying to make themselves known. And one of the problems here is, I talk to many of my Kurdish friends, they say that people in Damascus know more about American culture, American film, TV, celebrities, things like this, than they know about what's going on in the Kurdish areas of their own country, right? I think during any kind of armed conflict, media, information, and narrative certainly become a part of the war. Every side has theirs. Certainly in Syria, many very powerful state actors poured a lot of money and resources into promoting certain narratives of the developments. And one of the impacts that that has on a country is people end up only knowing about their neighbors, their fellow citizens, through very biased, often maliciously intended, often foreign funded channels. And this is very dangerous. So I think that civil society engagement is something that can break through that. And there certainly are opportunities now, but there are also very serious challenges. Again, nobody knows what the situation is going to be like in the future. Again, we've seen the sectarian and ethnic violence, the sort of cracking down on civil space. This government has a very specific idea of the type of state that it wants to create, that is dominated by one particular ethnicity, one particular religion, where women's roles are limited, where economic power is in the hands of very few people. And I think that when civil society decides to move in a way that challenges those things, it may face issues. And that's, I think, why it's so important for them to engage now, while they still have space and to take as much space as they can.
I mean, you spoke about some of the risks of foreign funding, and on that, particularly what we're seeing, today, and the agreement that was made between the SDF and the transitional government, uh, that mostly came about through the through the pushing and the pressure almost of the US, and particularly led by Tom Barrack, who is the envoy to the region and the US ambassador to Turkey. It seems, and some have suggested that the US is willing to turn a blind eye to some of the issues that we've discussed in terms of some of the actions of the transitional government in the name of settling a particular system in Syria that would benefit particularly trade. And when we talk about that, it's also important to bring in that the majority of Syria's oil and gas reserves are in the northeast. So much of its agricultural output, of Syria's output, comes from the northeast. And it seems that part of the drive to centralize control of this region has been also economic. Damascus and seemingly the US want these resources under a centralized authority to make access to them simpler. So what I want to ask is, does what are the risks of this, and does the Northeast energy offer opportunities for its people too?
Well, I think that the risks, as you outlined, are very severe. There's a couple of recent articles that have been looking into this. This has been a topic among many Syria watchers that the economy that is being created is still, one, very much in control of the hands of powerful individuals linked to the state, and two, is geared towards foreign investment in a way that could be very exploitative of Syrians, civilians, communities, working class people, people made so impoverished by the war in the future. There was a recent piece at the Middle East Institute looking at the country's investment laws, finding that these are, one, very similar to the investment laws under the old regime, but actually give the new state even more power and give foreign investors and corporations even more benefits to be able to operate, at the expense of course, the Syrian public. And the New York Times published an article a few weeks ago about the intervention of a Syrian billionaire with Trump and people close to him, to sort of advocate for sanctions relief, which of course is a positive thing in and of itself. No society deserves to be under these kind of crushing unilateral economic sanctions. But he made that argument by pitching investment projects from which the US president and people close to him could benefit. And I think when we look at the switch in US support from the military cooperation with the SDF to this push for Damascus, much of it is related to the individual economic interests of many of the leaders involved on the Syrian side, in the US, and also in countries like the Gulf and Turkey. We're not even necessarily talking about nationwide economic interests because, we're not seeing regular Syrians, regular Turks, regular people in any of these countries really benefiting from much of this.
Mm,
It is these elite who are making the decisions who are going to do quite well. And I think, we've spent so much of this conversation talking about social, political, civil rights grievances. People are willing to tolerate quite a lot, especially after having suffered through a war, if they have some basic economic stability, if they can get a good job, if they can put food on the table for their family, right? But when people's rights are being taken away and simultaneously everything is getting more expensive, there's more unemployment, there are more economic problems, then you have a much greater risk of unrest because people have much less to lose. One thing I've heard from many of my Syrian Kurdish friends is that everything has been getting more expensive since integration. They don't really feel like they're going to benefit, right? And that's to your point. The Northeast has never benefited from the massive economic resources there. It was always a place where raw materials were extracted, like oil and gas, like agriculture, things like this. And the industry was always in places like Damascus and Aleppo, right? And this led not just the Kurds, but also the rural Arab communities of the Northeast, the Christians, the Yazidis, everyone, to be both economically less well off and seen socially as lesser by elites in other parts of the country. I think somebody remarked to me once that part of the transitional government's animosity towards the SDF comes from a sort of class place of why do we, Ahmed al-Shara himself is from Damascus. He did that detour through Al-Qaeda and Idlib, but he comes from, a well-off family, a family of educated people. Many of the other people in the government are the same. And of course, the state institutions under the regime were largely kept intact. So these elites, during this integration process, they had to negotiate with people from places like Afrin and Kobani, very rural agricultural areas that never really had power. And I think that that class element, that economic element, that sort of element of social superiority that people on the government side felt also played a role in the negotiations. And we're not really seeing anything to suggest that this government is going to have a different economic relationship towards the Northeast. And the foreign investment part of it, when we bring that in, everything is pointing towards a Syrian economy that is going to make a small group of people very rich and that is going to leave the regular people devastated by war in a very difficult position. And when you add authoritarianism, the marginalization of ethnic and religious minorities, the marginalization of women on top of that, that could create a very explosive situation in the
Mm,
future.
mm. I mean, finally, what I want to ask you is, as you've mentioned as well, the US militarily, so not politically, but militarily backed the Syrian Democratic Forces against the so-called Islamic State. It still maintains a small military presence in the northeast. And, but for example, the elections that just happened in the region were held under a framework where Ahmed al-Shara appoints a third of the assembly himself. So, as you've mentioned, economically and so on, and, kind of state structures that are either very similar to the Assad era, and in some cases actually almost worse, um, in that it's attached a lot of power to an individual. In this case, the president. You also a lot of your work is also briefing U.S. Officials quite regularly. What can you say in terms of what is the U.S. Position? And perhaps it's difficult to say that there is one, but is there one? And or if there's multiple, what is the US position on the developments in Syria, and how do US officials see the developments in Syria in the context of a changing region?
Well, I think that going back to the economic discussion, when we're talking about the most powerful decision makers, about the president, about his envoys, they're looking at, first and foremost, I think these economic relationships, and they see everything going well so long as those relationships are not threatened or interrupted. I think at the level of the state overall, there's certainly benefit seen in having taken Syria out of the Russian camp and moved it to the US camp. Certainly a benefit seen in keeping it out of the war with Iran. And again, these aren't necessarily bad things. Many people in Syria from many different communities in many parts of the country are, of course, very happy that their country has not gotten involved in this regional catastrophe. People are very critical of many reports circulating online of the potential that Syria would go and fight the Shia militias in Iraq or things like this. So that stability, I think, is something that is good for everyone. But
Mm,
it is also seen as a point in favor, I think, of the government on the US side. And when you look at US strategy in the region today, the Trump administration started this war with Iran. Now, in negotiations, major objectives of those negotiations are to actually return to the status quo that existed before the war, not to necessarily extract any concessions. I think Israel sees this current political situation in the US as its last chance to get US support for its ambitions to pursue regional hegemony. Turkey, I think, is benefiting from these very close, not just institutional, but also personal relationships. Both its institutional relationship as a state with the US government and the personal relationships of Erdogan and his circle with Trump in his circle. These are very close. That's putting them in a good position. But Turkey is very concerned about this war with Iran as well, and whether it will go on, concerned about Israeli hegemony, and, is of course trying to project its hegemony in the region as well. So this is a time of regional change. And I think with the US, there are also many internal domestic political factors that kind of impact how this is being looked at. The war in Iran is incredibly unpopular among the American people. This
Mm,
is one of the reasons why I think Kurdish actors in Rojhelat, East Kurdistan, and in Iran chose well in choosing to stay out of, I think, US plans for the war, because even if this is something that Trump goes through with, under domestic political and economic pressure, it could change at any time. A
mm,
future US administration, even a Democratic Congress, if that's elected in the midterms, might choose to put restrictions on this. Or Trump may find it so damaging to his own popularity that he may stop, right? So there's a domestic political aspect there.
mm, mm,
There are many discussions about what a different US foreign policy could look like after these atrocities in Iran, these atrocities in Palestine, all done with the support of the US over the past few years. Many people, both of course among the public and even now in the establishment, want a different path. And so this is a time of, I think, uncertainty, both in terms of what this current administration will do and what its actions will lead to, as a reaction amongst both the right and the left, the different sides of US politics.
mm,
In all of that, where does the question of Northeast Syria fit? I think the most important lesson is that, look, if you want to end the endless wars, right? If you
mm,
want to have stability, if you want to have security, you need to promote, governments that are representative of their people, that have economies that work for everyone, that do not exclude and marginalize, entire communities. We've seen time and time again that, the US will go in, it will fight a war, it will break something, it will declare victory, it will leave, and then, years later it will come back in,
mm,
right? I think their bet with Syria was that their support for this government, would end the conflict, would create some level of stability. And we've seen sometimes signs pointing towards that. We've also seen signs pointing towards serious instability, whether it was these bouts of sectarian violence last year, the
mm,
attacks on the Kurds and the SDF, these sort of concerning economic trends. There are really no guarantees now that this current system in Syria will last. And there are concerning signs that if it does last and continue building in the directions that it's building, that this could cause problems. And so I think the lesson for the US here should be that if you don't want to then 10 years from now have to go back to the Middle East, if you don't want to have another endless war, if you really want to sort of stay out of this, as a growing number of Americans, both on the left and on the right, are saying, you need to build democracy, religious freedom, women's rights, all of these things in a way that is led by local people at the initiative of the people who actually live there. This is what Northeast Syria had. This is what, communities fought for a very long time. And look, I'll say this as a sort of final closing note, right? When the government was able to extract these concessions out of the SDF, it was able to do so because of its ability to very quickly politically flip the Arab majority regions under the SDF, where the SDF made serious mistakes in governance, right? Where local communities had real grievances. You didn't have the same sort of cohesion and, development of structures as you had, amongst the Kurdish community, the other ethnic and religious minorities of the Northeast. But the government is now, in its treatment of these regions of Kobani, northern Hasaka, where Kurds and other communities live, it's pursuing a policy that's even more exclusive and even more repressive than the very worst of anything that the SDF had done in its mistakes in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. This government knows, it came from a radical group, right? From a group that tried to overthrow a system. It understands that when people have grievances, political actors can use those grievances to create change and create instability.
mm,
And so if it pursues this path and continues to create these grievances, it may be essentially signing its own fate.
mm. Thank you so much for your time today, Megan.
Thank you as well.
And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.